I'm very pleased to introduce our lecturer tonight, Lois Weinthal, who is the chair of the Interior Design Program at Ryerson University. Most of you know that she wrote the book that most of you have been required to get for your courses, Toward a New Interior, an anthology of interior design theory, which has some really great, beautiful, relevant chapters for both IDSDU and interiors and architecture as well. She is the editor. She is formerly. Oh dear, I lost my place. Her practice investigates the relationship between architecture, interiors, clothing, and objects, resulting in works that take on an experimental nature. Her teaching explores these topics in design studios that include full-scale construction from clothing to rooms and theory seminars. Additional publications besides the Toward a New Interior are Interiorscapes in Feminist Practices of 2011, Bridging the Threshold of Interior and Exterior, an interview with Petra Blaise in AD Architectural Design in 2008, and House Lab in the JAE Journal of Architectural Education in 2006. She has received grants from the Graham Foundation, Fulbright, and Dodd, and has exhibited and lectured nationally and internationally. Previously, she was director of the Interior Design Program at Parsons and graduate advisor for the Master of Interior Design Program at the School of Architecture at the University of Texas at Austin, and knows a really good friend of mine. She received her Master of Architecture from Cranbrook Academy of Art and Bachelor of Architecture from the Rhode Island School of Design. So let's give her a big welcome.
Thank you for that generous introduction, and also thank you to everybody for inviting me to come here. I just turned the microphone on, but if you can't hear me, just let me know. Just shout out and let me know, and I'll talk louder or talk into both microphones. And so I'm just showing you some slides that are required. These are some things that I will do today in the learning objectives. You will be tested on this afterwards. But I'm so glad to hear that the book is being, I'm going to stand over here because I'm a little short and that's really tall, so this way I can kind of see some of you guys. But I'm glad to see that the book has found its way here, and that's primarily what I'll be talking about today. It came about when I first started teaching at the University of Texas at Austin and realized that when I was in architecture, I could look at every bookshelf and find a book on theory. But for interiors, it was lacking, and felt the need to have something put together that would make people think beyond just the history of interior design, but actually taking that into theory and thinking about how we can explore that space from multiple perspectives. So that's where the book primarily came from. And what I'd like to do today is walk you through the different layers or chapters, more formally, that were developed for the book as a way of thinking about how can we structure a new organization for the interior that's not just chronological the way that history books organize the interior, but one that might be more inherent to the way that a designer thinks about interior design. And for me, that really stems from the layers that surround us, everything from our skin to our clothing to the furniture we sit in to the interior, finally to the exterior, where poche, the thickness of a wall, bridges interior and exterior. So that was the main organization of the book that I was interested in working on. And with that, I was also interested in a set of almost, I guess, other terms that I knew were important to the interior, but couldn't necessarily be defined as a distinct layer. And some of those included elements such as nostalgia, which to me is so much a part of the interior, poche, craft, sustainability, gender, and it kind of goes on and on. And so rather than trying to slip those into distinct layers, they're more of elements that exist as a cross-section throughout all of the layers. And it also gave me the opportunity to finally take advantage of what an index offers. And I know a lot of the time when I find a topic in a book that's covered, or somewhere in the body of the text and I want to know more about it, the index is always the place you can go to. And so this index, it includes the different layers, which I feel like are funny ways of inserting things into maybe an established lexicon that we have, but trying to insert new phrases that could find their way into more publications that people start to work on. So, in textiles, there's certain areas such as how mapping the interior can relate to textiles, especially when we think about surfaces as a map. And there's a group of students, I hope you're all out there, that I worked with today in a workshop, and it was really great for me to see what they came up with, and a lot of the things that they were addressing did come from some of these ideas that you're seeing in the index. So what I'd like to do is walk you through, I guess maybe some of the really important highlights of the book for me, and try to draw some connections between them, some threads between them. The nice thing about looking at clothing and textiles and interiors is that I get to use a lot of puns. So, I get to say things are, threads woven between these, or weaving this topic into another. And so you probably have to go through hear some bad puns throughout this lecture. I'll try to contain myself. But before I jump too far into the book, I also wanted to just read a little bit of the introduction that helps establish, I think, some of the instincts that I had that I knew would eventually lead me to interior design. And with Mark Wigley's writing, he has a quote, "There's no such thing as a simple room." And for me, that actually started from the place of growing up. And so I'm just going to read a few short paragraphs. And then I promise I won't be doing that much more reading. So the house I grew up in was a 1960s suburban tract model home. The exterior was traditional with brick and wood siding, and the interior had white walls and wood floors. In the mid-1970s, my mother hired an interior decorator, and the house exploded. The beautiful wood floors were covered in 3-tone shag carpet, and the white walls were covered in wallpaper. This was the 70s. In some rooms, 2 intense wallpaper patterns met at a corner, producing a dizzying effect. Our quiet suburban home was now loud. I tried to push the loud color and patterns into the background as I longed for the wood floors lying underneath the shag carpet. At 10, I was already nostalgic. My longing for these underlying surfaces speaks to an aesthetic that Le Corbusier coined as type objects, objects that are well-made, neat and clean, pure and healthy. The interior decorator turned our type object house into the opposite, described by Le Corbusier as the personal, the arbitrary, the fantastic, the eccentric, which for him he sees as being the negative. Unlike architecture, the interior can arbitrarily be personalized at every detail and can easily cross the threshold between the two opposing identities in Le Corbusier's statement. And so for me, it's important to kind of always keep that in mind, because in some ways, the way that Le Corbusier thought about typical objects is so much of the way that we can look at objects and all the things that surround us. And I'll get into that a little bit more once I start moving through some of these slides. But first I want to take you through the first layer, and what I'll do, what I have done is always at the top right, you'll see the different chapters, and the one that looks hopefully in bold is the one that I'll be talking about, just to help try and keep these things in order and to show that shift from one layer to the next, and to me where I see that happening. And for body and image, the classical view of the body has always been Leonardo da Vinci, and then along comes, with the Vitruvian Man, and then along comes the Modular Man, and also Henry Dreyfuss's work with just working with ergonomics. And for me, they're all men trying to shape the body into these uniform systems, or showing us how geometry is produced from the body. And when I came across the work of Rebecca Horn, I realized that she was doing something similar, where she's using these white wings that she calls them, and beginning to scribe geometry around her. But what she does is she takes it one step further than that iconic imagery of the Vitruvian Man standing inside of the circle and square, where she actually closes the wings off and produces an interior space. So I try to think of her work as sort of an argument for pushing the classical kind of old imagery into a new one that interiors can now claim. And she also thinks about how the body is mapped in space as well. And a lot of the times we're always looking at orthographic projection through our drawings and plans, sections, elevations. And she brings that directly to the body in this project for a pin box. And this is part of an early body of work that she did in the 70s, which kind of left after the 70s, and then she moved into other things, although you see some of it kind of surfacing in her later work. But to me, there's such a clarity in how the body is represented, and when she's standing at the core of it, the pins get pushed against her. It's like those things that people can push their hands into, and before those came along was Rebecca Horn doing this. And then when she steps out, you begin to see her silhouette, or the profile of her body, showing up in that space. And what I do want to do is quickly jump to clothing and identity, because there's a lot in the next few layers that I do want to focus on. But for me, the shift happens when we start thinking about another way of measuring the body. So where Rebecca Horn is doing it in one way with the pin box, we see it happening in other ways in how tailors and seamstresses begin to tailor clothing to the body. But before they can shape cloth, they have to understand the shape of the body to do that. There's a really great essay by Kirsten Kraft called Cutting Patterns in the book, where she really does look at the way the history of cutting cloth has evolved from essentially just being draped as one big cloth over the body with a hole cut out at the center and then belted around the waist, to becoming very much about patterns and understanding where seam lines are. And in the process of clothing becoming more specific to the body and starting to develop sizes that are regular, that people begin to use. So with that, one person that she looks at is William Bloomer Pollock, who designed this measuring device for the body. And it has a lot of pieces and parts to it that you slide across and move, and eventually the shape of the body comes through, and then you take that off and you have the measurements. And one can also think of it as the precursor in a very analog way of a 3D body scan. So when we think of 3D body scans, right now we imagine somebody sitting or lying in a space and getting their body scanned, almost like when you have to go to the airport now. And the earlier version is one where it's much more mechanical, and the hand is kind of doing the moving around to really understand what that object is. And at a more simpler view, another example is really just kind of the cross-section through the body as an example of how we can understand its proportions and dimensions. And when we start adding cloth to the body, I like to look at these two images from an essay called Drapery by Anne Hollander. And she's interested in exactly that, drapery, but by looking at drapery, one term that comes out of it is always the fold. And the fold I feel like it was, because it's part of an architectural history and theory that took place, late 80s, early 90s, and was never really situated in the context of interiors. And so to me, it actually seems in some ways very appropriate to bring into the context of interiors because of the way that so much material is folded, and how drapery goes along with that. And so in these two images, Anne Hollander, she shows at one point how the drape of cloth begins to show excess and wealth, and it has to do with certain demographics that can afford to have images or portraits like these made. And in the one on the right, she adds a bit of an anthropomorphic spin to it, where she talks about the gentleman having his portrait drawn, but there's not the wife or his woman that might be next to him. I can't remember how she describes it. Something where it seems very secondary, but that the feminine figure shows up in a secondary form as a draped curtain next to him that's kind of lightly leaning into him. And so she brings this anthropomorphic quality to the painting in her analysis of it. At a very different end of how the body is clothed, Hüseyin Çağlayan, a Turkish clothing designer, places a lot of emphasis on the way that materials are shaped to the body. And he tends to look at a lot of furniture design in the wood corset. You can almost imagine that it's something that Charles and Ray Eames would almost produce because of their bent plywood furniture. He also looks at airplanes and ships to see how things like fiberglass is shaped, and brings that to clothing. And for him, clothing is more about a container, and sometimes it contains personal possessions, sometimes it contains your own self, which is a personal possession. It becomes a big part of how he thinks about his work or his collections from one season to the next. And as a continuation of his work, I just want to show these three images that are a sequence taken from one of his fashion shows, where for him, in his own background, he's sort of shuffled between countries and due to war, and so he's always looking at what makes home and homeland. And for a fashion designer to be asking those questions is it's pretty provocative, because fashion is something that we always think about as being a bit excessive, and he's trying to bring another set of questions to it, which are, ask us to think a little bit more almost the way that we do when we house ourselves. And so in this collection that he worked on, at first you're seeing the models, they come out, they begin to remove the upholstery that's made to fit the furniture. They slowly take it off, they put it on themselves, and then snap everything into place. And so he's doing, I would say, two things in this sequence. One is he's showing that there's a direct relationship between the scale of the body in our clothes and then the scale of our body to the furniture that we sit in and the textile that covers the furniture but also covers the body, that there's some connection between those. But in the last one, what you're not seeing is that the furniture actually folds up into suitcases, and he sees that as a way of taking part of your home with you. And so everything that was the furniture now becomes part of what you take with you. There's a table in the center there. He continues that idea with this part. The model comes out, she pulls out the centerpiece, steps inside, and then eventually slips it on as a skirt. And so, not that it's the most comfortable skirt to wear. I would wear it. I can't afford it, but I would wear it. And for him, he sees that as one more way of kind of pushing that boundary of how far would you go to actually take these things with you. So, at this point, this is where I'd like to move into furniture and objects. And one iconic person that I always look to, which the book is also alluding to, is Le Corbusier. And this image, I like to show it because it follows up on that idea of that description I was reading to you before about what makes a space appropriate, that it's clean, healthy, surfaces are meant to be wiped. The only decoration you need are things that are more natural. He talks about how a quartz gem placed on a table is the kind of decoration you should have because it's just natural. It doesn't have bad manufacturing quality to it, which was his concern at the time. And so here you see vases with flowers on them, and he's highlighting machinery, the typewriters at the time. So in some ways you can see how he's trying to think about the typical object as being everything that shows up in his settings. And for somebody like Le Corbusier and also Adolphe Loos, who I'll show in a few more slides, for them, even just the staging of their photographs is so important to show what their ideas are. And we see that a lot now in contemporary media, where so much of how a room looks, how it's staged, becomes everything in terms of what one's trying to convey as a way of living or working. And so with that, I also like to think about what a typical object is. And in these images by Alan Wexler, he is working with some objects that are almost iconic. So it was a project that used a Milford vinyl shed, which is a kind of off-the-rack shed that you can purchase. And it has that iconic typology of just being a shed, pitched roof, very plain. And the chairs that he's housing inside of this are also very iconic. And so if I just go back to Le Corbusier and put this out there to all of you and say, if I say the word chair, what kind of chair do you think of? And is it a plain wood chair like these, or do you think of something very different? And my guess is that we all probably think of something that's pretty similar. And that in some ways is Le Corbusier honing in on the fact that there's certain basic forms that we look at, and then styles over time, they kind of attach to things, then they deattach, and then another style latches on, then that one goes away. And that it's really, there's that underlying form which is so important that then lets us kind of change it as styles change. And in the shed, Alan Wexler, he's working with these kind of iconic chairs and tables, and that's something that he does. He really appreciates the really basic forms. But he's also challenging something that is pretty second nature to us, which is the thickness of a wall and its poche. And he's now actually using the poche and breaking its normal boundary to allow furniture and the table to be housed within it. So he's treating it almost as if it is a flexible space. And then on the outside, the interesting part is that it still becomes useful as table and chair. So the client can either have an empty room or the objects put in the space. There's the simple, to me it's always that simple idea which then brings complexity to it. And I feel like a lot of Alan Wexler's work builds upon that. That's a hard one to say, Alan Wexler's work. Okay. So Another person who builds upon working with furniture and exploring ideas in them is Courtney Smith, and she also embeds a lot of anthropomorphic qualities in her work as well. Sometimes they allude to animals, insects, people. She kind of ascribes different personalities to them. And she even names her pieces in ways that they kind of allude to having a personality. And in these two images that I'm showing you from her work, on the left is a table that she was working on. And I should also explain that these pieces, they came about from her time living in Brazil as an artist, where she was working with discarded furniture, and that was her palette of materials. And she kept saying, well, what can I do with these things? And started tinkering with them and figuring out that they had this kind of other life to them after being discarded. And so the one on the left, she reconfigured in a way where it's no longer just a small boudoir table that a woman would typically sit at, but it's become something that almost feels like it's ready to kind of walk or fly away, a little bit like a dragonfly. And so she starts changing them and altering them so things collapse or they expand. And so that starts to give them a personality just because of the kind of mobility that they have within them. And the one on the right, to me, is sort of the better picture of how she describes bringing personalities to pieces. And this was a whole boudoir collection where there's tables and chairs, something that kind of fills up a room as a collection. And she worked with all these pieces so that everything can collapse down and fit within the larger boudoir piece and close off. And the way that she thinks about it is that it's really more like a protective shell that the person kind of can hide in. And when they're comfortable enough, all the pieces start migrating out. So it's not really the person, but it's more the furniture having that personality of being either the extrovert or the introvert. So with those things, I also like leading into some writings by Georges Perec, which deal with the ordinary. And I'm just going to read this small quote from his writings, which he says, "What we need to question is bricks, concrete, glass, our table manners, our utensils, our tools, the way we spend our time, our rhythms. To question that which seems to have ceased forever to astonish us. We live true, we breathe true, we walk, we open doors, we go downstairs, we sit at a table in order to eat, we lie down on a bed in order to sleep. How, where, when, and why." And in the previous two works with Courtney Smith and Alan Wexler, in some ways they are challenging those things, especially with Alan Wexler in terms of how we even think of a wall and how he begins to break that wall apart. And here I love this one, how we think about a brick, and we're here surrounded by this room that's made up of modules. So there's always that question of what we do with these things. And this quote is used as a way to segue into works by Droog Design, which is a Dutch collaborative that's been around for quite a while now in Amsterdam, where they have their main headquarters. And if you get a chance to go to Amsterdam, you just have to go there because it's a great space to walk around. You see all the pieces. They're always doing something. They've recently opened up a hotel, so they're kind of working from objects, but now thinking about the way people live with things. So it's kind of this full experience. And to continue on the writings of Perret, he also writes, "What is there under your wallpaper?" And that's a way of thinking about how Droog Design, and in their collaborative, where some designers come in sometimes and they do work and they go under the name of Droog Design, and other times they come out in their own designer. So it's an interesting model as a way of designers working. And this is a wallpaper designed to cover up a wallpaper that you would want to get rid of. So in that description of my horrible 1960s house that I grew up in, I would have done anything at the time to be able to have this wallpaper and cover up, a corner where two 1970s wallpaper patterns were meeting, just to kind of neutralize the space. So they're thinking about how there's layers of history that can also be shown by showing a little bit of the past, but now bringing a new present to it. They also look at some objects that we see on a daily basis and reconsider those. And so now that I've moved back northeast from where I was in Texas for so long and didn't have radiators because they just don't need them in Texas, and now have radiators in my house in Toronto, it's funny looking at them and then seeing the project on the right by Droog Design, where they're rethinking that standard kind of object type radiator that we're so used to seeing. And here they've actually taken advantage of that and reconfigured it into something that becomes ornament or decorative into a space, but it still functions in the same way. So to me, that's just kind of like, why didn't anybody think of that before? So it's nice to have that insight. And similarly, with a dining table, a tablecloth, where it was designed to initially show the remains or what a tablecloth might look like at the end of a meal, capturing spills that have happened or plates that get shifted around or silverware. And there's different processes that you can use to capture that kind of movement. And they have done that, but now printed it as a tablecloth that you can actually use. So while you may have a new table, a clean table setting awaiting company, you still get the memory of remains, not the actual remains, but the memory of what may have happened at a previous event and showing beginning to end. And so that element of time becomes interesting to bring into the interior through these subtle ways. Heligan Garius is another designer who sometimes collaborates with Droog Design, other times she comes out, but pretty much has her own office established. And she did this really beautiful piece where obviously it's not that functional, but to me it speaks back to when I think about the layers of, the whole set of layers that I've established at the top as a way for me to kind of guide myself through interiors, that she's found this other strange kind of interstitial layer where when we look at pattern designs on dishware, and there's also pattern designs on tablecloths, that she's actually decided to merge the two together. And so, the interior is one of those spaces where I feel like that level of design doesn't really get talked about in design studios. It's just sort of like, oh yeah, there's something on the table, but right now I just have to figure out where to put the table. And we sometimes forget to think about those smaller, finer details, which she brings to light to us by showing that by working with this one pattern and actually connecting the two together, it makes our minds have to realize, oh, there are moments where there's opportunities for things to happen and show us or reveal to us things that we may not normally see. So while it's not that functional, I still like it. I probably can't afford it either. So with going on with that and this level of detail, I also like looking at Michel Serres' writing. I love it when a French philosopher, a really well-established French philosopher, is able to talk about curtains and bed linens and elements like that. So I'm just going to read this quote from him, which is, "The empiricist is astonished by the number of layers, strata, and partitions, from rough concrete to bed linen, the number of skins until we reach our real skin." And that layer of bed linen is one more of those layers that we don't really think about, but it's something that our body engages for, if you're a student, I'm assuming maybe hopefully 6 hours a night. If you have a 9-to-5 job, maybe 8 hours a night. But it's something where, if you read in bed, then you're in there longer. But it's something that we sometimes don't think about so much, but it's actually something that our body is next to for probably more hours than many other elements that we care significantly more about. So that's why I like kind of pulling this one element out and talking about it for a little bit, even though it might, bore some of you. I don't care. Just have to put emphasis on it because I think it's an important one for us to think about. And the fact that he is kind of also thinking about those layers that we do move through from the soft all the way to the hard concrete. And when I think about skins, these are a few examples from Ellen Lupton's book on skins. And she shows different examples in the way that we can think about it. The first one on the left by Nowhere, and hopefully you get the sense, I'm not sure how the lighting looks, but it has a skin-like quality to it. And they're bringing a pattern, a digital pattern to skin, so it's not really skin. But as an office, Nowhere is pretty interesting. They've started developing further skin patterns where they now work with models and they digitally just render their skin differently, but where models are usually showing clothing designers and labels or insignia that represent different labels, they're now bringing those insignias to the actual representation of the skin, so it looks like there's a kind of a Chanel pattern on the skin, and it's a little strange to look at. They're very strange, but at the same time, it makes you think about a much larger picture of identity and the way that we do brand ourselves. So they're taking an interesting look at it from their work. At a kind of different end of that, Donna Franklin looks at organic matter. So this is different types of lichens and molds that she cultivates and sews together into garments. So they actually do have a lifespan. You know, you can say they're like the ultimate sustainable fashion garment because they degrade naturally, or you can compost them. But once again, it only has a certain lifespan as well. So there's that, both sides to that, which then raises the question of, you know, how do we think about sustainability? Which there's a few moments like that I'm going to get to as I keep moving through this. And lastly, Jürgen Bay, another designer who, you know, when I look at these chairs, I think about typical objects because they're masked under a skin, but they do begin to evoke that notion of the typical object that Le Corbusier talks about. But here he's wrapped them in a new skin, and so there's reference to them, but we see them in a new way as well. He also sets the furniture into different relationships with one another, which then speaks about how people engage or disengage from one another, if two people are back to back versus being side to side or facing front to front, and that suddenly the social structure becomes an important part of even just the way we place chairs together. Another person who works really well within this realm is Petra Blaise and her office Inside Outside. And her work is pretty interesting. She primarily works with textiles, does a lot of curtains, and when I say curtains, not in a sense like, you know, here's just textile taken off the bolt and it becomes the curtain. For her, she brings I would say another agenda to it, and I like showing the Casa de Musica, which was a collaboration with Rem Koolhaas in Porto, Portugal. And in this project, she makes reference to the site, so she actually is looking to location and the site as a way for her to begin to develop what is a curtain that becomes site-specific. And we don't really think about that too much. I think we think about, you know, landscapes and architecture being site-specific, but the interior can be a little bit of a free-for-all because sometimes we're in rooms that are completely enclosed and there's no reference to the outside. And so her work actually does try to bridge that, which hence comes the name Inside Outside for her office. And just to give you a bit of a background in how she does that, in the two woven curtains, for her she was looking at the culture of Porto and knowing that it's right on the water where there's a lot of fishing. And so one thing that she took from that culture was the fishing nets that were the tied rope and brought that to be one part of the curtain, but was also interested in the formal traditions that people have on weekends of going to church and women wearing veils over their heads and looking at the veiling of textiles and beginning to kind of knot that around or make a weave around the fishing net. So she's making reference to these two things that are inherent to the culture and bringing that to the interior through these different layers that then kind of operate as view filters or screens, or sometimes there's other layers that come in to kind of completely close off the outside from the inside. So in terms of hermetic spaces, this is one that I do just want to spend a few minutes on because I think it is an important part of the interior. And this is also shifting into the layer on mapping the interior, which is in some ways a little bit of a change too from the other ones that were much more about being object-based and you can kind of name and point to those things. Whereas in this one, once you finally have the collection of all those previous elements, it then becomes a matter of how we move through them. And so that's where, for me, mapping the interior comes in. And then mapping can mean anything. So I just want to go through this image and this quote, which are both taken from a reading by Robin Evans. And the quote comes from Thomas Sheridan, where he writes, "Time alters fashions and frequently obliterates the works of art and ingenuity, but that which is formed in geometry and real science will remain unalterable." So I'm just going to take that apart for a minute because I think it links back to some of the previous things I talked about, but it also links forward to a few more things I'll talk about. And so when Sheridan is writing about how geometry is grounded in science and doesn't change, that the reason I'm also showing this image with it is because he's making the argument that the orthographic drawing is that geometry, that when we show plan, interior elevations, or sections, or anything that's grounded in that orthographic drawing, it is, you can't argue with it. It's always, right, it's measurable, it has logic to it. But that part about how fashion then begins to come and go, how it changes over time, and it doesn't have the same sort of groundedness as the orthographic drawing, is what he's showing here in the decorations, the furniture that show up. And it's a little bit like Le Corbusier's typical object. In some ways we can say that the orthographic drawing carries that same equality where like with Le Corbusier and the typical object, that with the chair that sort of is iconic as a chair, that one can always see that as an underlying form, but then different styles come and go and they work on and off of that. And so that's where I like to make some connections between those two things, that it doesn't just have to end with objects, but it continues into the way that we work as conventions set up within disciplines. And so when I read that was part of when I was in graduate school at Cranbrook, and I was finding my way into the interior and realized that was the realm that I wanted to be working in. And was a little, mad because it was essentially saying that architecture comes first and whatever you place on the interior is secondary. And I kept thinking, no, there has to be a way around that. And so for me, it was about taking one of these developed surface drawings and saying, well, what if I find another way to say the objects on the interior are the things that are the orthographic drawing. They get drawn in plan and section, and you see their full view mapped out in signs. But when you do that, you can almost imagine taking the sheet of paper that the drawing's on and cutting it up and having to flatten out everything that surrounds the chair, because the chair is the thing that's now seen in orthographic projection. And I apologize if this sounds really confusing. It probably is to give in a 2-minute explanation, but just wanted to show that for myself it became more of a challenge to say, how can the interior take priority in a space? And so at the time I was working with a lot of patterning and working with darts, and for me, there's clothing darts, but there's also darts that can be found in a space like this, where you can imagine if you fold up these corners and literally fold it up from this paper, you would actually end up with this little pocket of space. And so that in some ways becomes like a dart that we find in clothing. It's something that lets you go from 2 dimensions to 3 dimensions. And that's one of the areas that I realized there's something that's allowing change to happen here. So it was working with that, with clothing, and then decided to make a chair and say, well, I'm going to make it at full scale. I'm going to unfold it and see what happens to the floor that it's attached to. So constructed it and realized that I could insert this notation of the dart within the chair to show how, as an instruction, it could begin to unfold. So it becomes in some ways notational, just like a dart is in clothing pattern, where it's a notation until it gets folded up, and then it helps you make something 3-dimensional. So this in some ways is working backwards, showing the chair unfolded, and then finally showing how the floor that it sits on had to be cut in different ways in order to unfold that. So the floor is no longer seen as the dominant thing that's put together. So I feel like I won, at least I like to think that. And another person who also works with patterns, and this was before I was working on my thesis work, Janine Santori, was somebody that I was looking at, and she was also interested in the patterns that come out of furniture and just objects, and the idea of where one cuts the certain line to make an orthographic drawing, to know how to unfold an elevation or where that plan should unfold from, because all those things give us reference points and ways of grounding ourselves and seeing what we're looking at. And so she was working within a small room and used this wonderful material called liquid latex and coated the surface of everything that was in the room that was, within reasonable bounds, and then figured out where to begin to score the skin once it had set and dried, and then unfold it. So essentially she's unfolding all the objects within this room. And then you see a funny set of crisscrossing in these white lines throughout it. And that was her just trying to show, well, this object was on here, but I have to slide it over to show the whole thing mapped out. So there's kind of an underlying notation within it as well. Monica Wyatt, who was working roughly at the same time, and was also interested in working with the body and unfolding the surface of the body. She was also very interested in the kind of expansion and contraction of when we breathe and understanding how that might affect, even that as an interior space. And so when Monica and Janine were working at Cranbrook, it must have been like a time of liquid latex when somehow that seemed to be the material of choice, the way that we use certain tools now as the tool of choice. And so this is actually using cheesecloth with liquid latex over it, and then she figured out where to start scoring the latex and then unfolding it. The cheesecloth helps keep everything in place. But what becomes interesting is those parts of the body where curves happen and become a little bit more complex. You start seeing how the geometry gets a little unclear. Like you have to start making real decisions about how this surface can begin to unfold. So the nice thing about seeing what I think are the analog or hand version of unfolding curved surfaces is that you start finding these kind of funny zones or inconsistencies where things have to be negotiated. And when we do a lot of the things digitally, which I think are fantastic, we lose some of that tangibleness or areas of that could hold more potential. So I think the two kind of talking back to each other, one back and forth, actually could produce a really interesting set of forms or ways that we do continue to work. And then lastly, and some more of Monica's work, for her it's really about wanting to occupy skins, and literally took wallpaper off of a wall at one point and constructed a garment around her. So a different way of mapping the interior is to think about literally the air. And with Monica Wyatt's work, I mentioned just briefly how she was interested in how the lungs expand and contract and the air that we take in. And she was doing a bunch of other smaller projects that looked at how to kind of capture air. And one person that I look to is Jeff Siegel, who works with indoor air quality. And I love this one reference where the disposition of American life has led us to spend 18 hours inside for every hour spent outside. And that's a really significant thing that I think sometimes we don't quite register, that we spend that much time on the interior. And in his essay, he does a really nice job of kind of laying out the facts of particles in the air and bringing to light for us the kind of invisible things that are around us, or at least in the scale of parts per billion, which we don't really use on our architectural scale. It's a little bit beyond that. But there's another way of measuring the interior, which people in, I would say, complementary fields, such as engineers working with indoor air quality, that they're working at, and that it's nice to start having a dialogue with them to think about how one could start informing the other. Especially because with indoor air quality, there's certain materials that can help absorb pollutants in the air. Wool, for example, which can also be in the form of felt used on the interior, helps absorb formaldehyde. And so it becomes a nice way of thinking about how that relationship between knowing what's in the air and what materials could start working together to actually help clean the air in a very passive way rather than having air cleaners. So there's a lot that's happening in there. So at this point, I'm going to be shifting into private chambers, and the part about private chambers and public performance are meant to be complementary to one another. And thinking about how first, a lot of the times we experience our own private spaces that we live in, that we craft that space, and then finally how when we're in the public realm, it then leads to that space of outside. So it's kind of pulling you through in that direction. And there's a few essays that I include, but I wanted to show here because they both reference gender. And the one on the left is by Ed Lilly on the history of the boudoir, which is this wonderful little essay. I can't remember how I found it, but it's amazing how it takes you through the history of the development of the boudoir and then eventually how it disappeared. And whenever I talk about the boudoir with my students and the development of certain spaces and how some spaces have gotten just to be so excessive that it's like, do you need one room after another after another? And I like looking at, this is really cheesy, but I love doing this, where we look at the New York Times magazine and in the Sunday magazine, when you open up the first page, a lot of the times it's showing the latest, greatest condo that's being built, and they have all the floor plans, and it's like this incredible amount of square footage happening in New York City, which once again, I can't afford. hard, but someday maybe. But a lot of that you can almost trace back to these kinds of drawings of the boudoir. And the boudoir in here, I'm not going to be able to reach this because I'm too short, but if I were to like keep going straight up, I would hit that one little square room. But beyond that is this little narrow space, and that's the boudoir. And what was interesting that Ed Lilly uncovered in learning about the history of the boudoir is that it became a space that was meant to be the feminine space, that's the counterpart to the male cabinet or library. And there was definitely a hierarchy put into these where the library is meant to see where the man learns and reads and has his business meetings, where the boudoir is meant to be this kind of space where women are meant to kind of do their hair and get themselves primped and things like that. So it's really seen as a, I would say not that complimentary anymore. But what was interesting was that at the same time, that's when this was happening in the 18th century, these kinds of development of spaces, there was also the mass production of publications, of books starting to happen. And so women could now, they would start reading novels, they would be asked to read in the boudoir where it's more private, so that way they weren't being seen as starting to be, on the same level as men and having a library. So there was this interesting way of how even the names of rooms and the connotations that go along with them were really affecting the way that people used that space and saw that space, or how people wanted people to see a certain space. So it has an interesting history to it. Now I feel like boudoirs are gone, spaces have neutralized, and even in those like 3,000 square foot apartments in New York, they still show them as neutral. In a different example, in one that speaks about clothes, closet, and disclosure, it's the title of an essay by Henry Urbach. He's really looking at the closet as the space of identity and where somebody shows what they wear, how they represent themselves, but it also has a double sense too, in the sense that he writes about how the closet has been a space for one to have, where one has essentially repressed their sexual preference. And so he walks us through different plans, the development of the closet, where normally before closets were constructed as part of a structure, they used to just be boudoirs, and that's where you would place all your possessions. And then finally the wall became bloated, and that's where you have your closets, and that's where you store your identity. But the interesting part is that he places special emphasis on the door swing and thinks about how that reveals and conceals our identity, and it depends upon how much you want to show that what happens with a closet door. So there's a bit of that which happens, but then he also shows a typical drawing of what closets might look like with clothes in them and the identity that one has. So in terms of private spaces, those essays I think are really great at getting to gender. And in a slightly different way, I also like to look at an essay by Joel Sanders and Diana Fuss. And they're looking in one essay specifically on Freud's office that was from where they have documentation of it taken when it was still in Vienna, whereas now all of his possessions are in a museum in London. But the Vienna office is still there, it's just empty, or it's a museum, but it doesn't have all of his possessions. And what was so important to the office, which I love the way that they dissect the office through the set of photographs that they have and through drawings that they then construct, is that they start to uncover a set of relationships that Freud, I have no idea, it's not clear if they can confirm this either or not too, but the relationships that they show go so much hand in hand with the psychoanalysis that Freud was working with, where it's really about the psychoanalyst being the receiver to listening to the client or the patient and helping process that, but they're really meant to be passive and just listening. And in one of these, I think I'm just going to walk you through one of these because it's just amazing to me. They worked off of a series of photographs that were taken of Freud's office before he left Vienna. And somebody was smart enough to say, we have to document this space because it's going to be gone. So what they did was they used those photographs, and they also took measurements from the space to come up with some drawings that are partly, constructed drawings, almost like here's the section through the space, and here's the elevation as much as we can make. But they chose this one, which is his office, the consulting office, where he would first meet the client before going into the room where they actually have the actual listening and therapy taking place. And what happens, hopefully you can see this, but the client would come in and sit down in this chair, and this is Freud's desk over here. And on the desk, there's a mirror here by the window, which they're showing. Here's the section through the window and the mirror. And what would happen is the person would come in, sit down in the chair, and see themselves in the mirror. And then when Freud would come in, he would come in and sit down in his chair and basically replace the person looking at themselves. And so now they would be looking at Freud. So they're making this mental change of going from seeing themselves to now seeing Freud, who is the person that's now going to essentially hear their thoughts. And so for me, it becomes a really rich area to say that there's this type of organization of objects in a room that can reflect so much about a discipline or about what's happening between two people, especially in a setting like this. And then the other one is essentially just dissecting the famous couch of Freud and mapping out all of the images and objects that he collected. He was obviously working at a very Victorian time when objects were constantly, around you, and before modernism. I don't think he would slip into the world of modernism based upon his collections. But essentially, the interesting part that the two that Joel and Diana discovered through these analyses was that when the person is lying down on the couch, while there's so much stuff on the walls, they actually end up looking at a blank corner in the room. And so you wonder how much of that is intentional versus, was it just happenstance? So I don't know the answers to those, but I just like the idea of it. And then one other area that is so much about private chambers as well is the Anne Frank house. And I was there a couple of years ago, and it had finally occurred to me, I was like, this is a serious interior space. And to me, it had always been linked to history, but never really thought about it spatially. And so going through it was pretty incredible. It's interesting because and also the photographs that you're seeing here, these were ones that were reconstructed for an exhibition, and then if you do go there, you actually don't see any of the furniture there. And when I approached the Anne Frank house about wanting to publish parts of Anne Frank's diary that speak about the interior, and then photographs that they have of the space, both as the exhibition, but then how it looked when they found the space, they were very protective and said, I could not actually photograph I couldn't use the text from her diary. They're just still, they couldn't quite themselves see the connection between how one describes these private spaces on the interior to bringing that into the interior realm. So it's something I'm hoping to work on at some point, or to try and bring more into this discourse, but I know it takes a bit of time to do that. At the same time, I appreciate that they're protective of her writings. But what was interesting is that I'd always imagined that the Anne Frank house was just one single space that her family was living in, but it was actually it was a two-story space with an attic space, and there were two families living there plus another person who was brought in. So it was actually quite a lot of activity there. And because of that, they had to actually structure how they lived so that way on weekends, if they needed to have heat, they had to get heat into the house by burning wood the day before and not on a weekend, because if people in the surrounding neighborhood would see smoke coming out of the chimney from a warehouse that's not supposed to be occupied by people on the weekends, they would begin to suspect something happening. So all the kind of movements that they had to kind of manage in order to live in the space had to really be thought out in terms of what would then be brought to the outside. So it's a really kind of interesting relationship of inside and outside, and small sounds like flushing toilets. If a toilet gets flushed too many times, the workers in the warehouse will wonder, something is suspicious. So it's an interesting space. And also with that is this quote by Walter Benjamin, which I think kind of sums up a lot of that really well, which is to live means to leave traces. And that comes from also looking at Adolf Loos's work from an essay by Beatrice Colomina. And with going back to that idea of how one sets up a room for photographs, I think Adolf Loos does an interesting job of doing this, where these are two rooms that are adjoining and looking from one to another, and he actually kind of tricks the viewer in these. So in one case, he has a bowl and a cup and saucer, making it appear as if somebody has just been sitting there. But in this one, the musical instrument that is behind there is actually not there. It's just a representation of the musical instrument, knowing that when the space would be photographed, that that photography tends to kind of trick the eye sometimes, and so it actually is deceiving that it's not really there. With photography, James Casebeer is a photographer who goes into spaces and photographs them. He likes to go into typological spaces, things that represent school or hospital or things that feel like it's a typology. He goes in, he photographs them, and then he constructs small scale models, usually around that big, and articulates the light. And as a photographer, he has an amazing eye at knowing how to articulate light when he begins to come into some of these spaces. And so he makes these models, and what he does is he begins to take away anything that's distracting, that would make you kind of not really focus on the space itself. So things like, the exit sign that's here, or those kind of small peripheral things that we sometimes kind of know are there, but we try to ignore a little bit because we want to just see the space. Those are the things that he begins to eliminate. And Mark Wigley, who writes about his work, draws a really nice distinction between saying when does something appear to be the real photograph of a space versus looking like the photograph of a model. And Casebeer's work sort of bridges both of those. You can sort of believe it in both of them. And then he does bring in other elements like making spaces look flooded, which adds a whole other layer of, is this really a real space or is there something else going on? So it asks good questions. With public performance, I also like to look at film, and the CoAD brothers, while I'm not showing you one of their films, I hope if you haven't seen them, you'll at least on your own go out and watch some of their early animations. And their spaces are very dark, which I actually appreciate because it says that interiors don't always have to be these happy spaces, which we have like plenty of. But there's others that are a little bit strange and odd, and to me those are the ones that kind of stick with you and make you think a little bit more about them. And that to me is their work. That's what they definitely do. They do a lot of stop motion animation, and because it is basically sets that they're designing, they have liberty to defy gravity in their film. They can make sets do things that you can't do. So at one point where these two little funny creatures are, they pull this drawer out, and then from the side of the drawer, another drawer pulls out, and it's almost one of these things that's like the Matryoshka dolls, I can't remember, the little Russian nesting dolls. And so they can do so many things like that. And the question is, when does it have to stay in the realm of film versus when it can actually enter into our real world and make us experience objects or things that we use in a way that we just kind of have forgotten about or grown accustomed to other ways without thinking, oh, this can actually be redesigned. And with another public performance, to me the classic is having to look at Alfred Hitchcock's Rear Window. And it's a great film. Even if you haven't seen it, you should just see it, because even 60 years later, it's like I still watch it and I just can't believe the ending. So he's amazing. But at the time, he was working with so many great interior elements on this. Everything that ranges from the scale of the windows to matching the proportion of screens that the film would be shown on in movie theaters, to knowing that you would always be inside of the main space of the protagonist in this film, which you're seeing in the one on the right. And so the whole film basically takes place from this one room, and it's always looking out to the other rooms. And it brings in something I feel like is so innate to us, which is that peeping Tom issue. And I do admit that when I lived in New York, I was the worst peeping Tom, because I love just walking down streets and looking into people's windows, and I know I shouldn't, but it's that curiosity of, I see what's happening on the outside, but I really want to see what's happening on the inside. And so Hitchcock picks up on that in this courtyard scene where a story revolves, and I'm not going to go into it for those of you that haven't seen it, but it's definitely worth seeing. I'm now a peeping Tom in Toronto, hopefully not getting arrested. I don't trespass, I don't do anything like that. So two views that I also like to show are these, because Hitchcock choreographs the film so that you actually see people doing daily things, which I'm sure may have been like a little, risque at the time, to show these two characters, one who's kind of doing his daily, shaving, and the other one, I'm forgetting her name, the dancer, Miss Torso, who runs around, pretty much like this for most of the film. And so that's where the main character, a lot of peeping Tom happens. So at a different scale, where we can still see to the inside, this is the last layer, which is bridging interior and exterior. And I'm going to show a few examples from here, and then I was going to show a few examples of my student work, and hopefully there's enough time for that, but it's a much smaller part. But just as a way to show how when I do have my students in studio, how it links back to some of these layers. And it's not just about, here, let's read about these things, but how can we actually make things from these ideas? So I always think it's important to test those things. And so when we finally get to this layer of bridging poche inside and outside, I like looking at Gordon Matta Clark and his work, partly because he's so straightforward in the way that he thinks about, I'm going to just literally cut a section through a house and peel it away. And we do that in drawing and model, but he does that at full scale. And so to be able to actually then peer back in and look at his work, suddenly it shows us things that we don't see in our drawings, partly also because it's after the fact. It's after it's been lived in. And so that's when he has access and begins to start treating this as it's, going from the thing that's already been lived in back to a drawing into an orthographic realm, even the way he begins to photograph all the front, side, and back views of the house as well. In another example where part of Paris was being raised in order to build the Pompidou Center, he gained access to this one residential building where he basically took the space of a cone and almost like where the eye is looking and then grew out from there to now insert a new window in this building. So not only is the people from the inside able to see a bigger view to the outside, but he's actually drawing views from the outside now to the inside, where previously you wouldn't really be able to see through any windows because they were much smaller. So he's really thought about that view of inside and outside. Rachel Whiteread works in a similar way. I feel like because she followed, her work is more contemporary. Gordon Matta Clark passed away a while ago. She always gets compared to Gordon Matta Clark. It's kind of inevitable that it happens. But her work, to me, there's something very simple and complex about it. This is a project that put her on the map from 1993 called House. And it was essentially a house that she gained access to in an area of East London that was being also torn down to place a new park in this neighborhood to try and help kind of build up the neighborhood again. And she essentially, I just realized my arrow's on there, that's not very nice. So what she does is she essentially built a scaffolding on the inside and filled it with concrete, removed the skin, and reveals to us the house, but in a way where, we can never imagine, well, we could imagine if the skin were peeled away, you would then see walls, floors, but the volume of that space would be mostly lost. And here she's bringing back that volume, but in some ways making it almost the ghost of what it once was. And a lot of her work is always compared to as being kind of ghostly because of the white forms that come out of working with the materials like plaster or concrete that she primarily uses. And in these, she picks up details, even of wallpaper or paint that stuck from the wall where the release agent actually didn't work so well, but somehow it left some impression onto the surface. But for her, that's actually capturing part of the life of what was there, and I think that's what she does want to capture. And in the other view, you see how the floors and walls remained, and it begins to let you walk through the space. And so a lot of people, when they viewed this project, they would see a house and they would bring their own idea of what house meant. And in some ways, you become the space of the brick that once was there. So this is another space that was previously lived in. And the images that I'm showing you are all in the book, but except for the one on the far right, which I went through this long debate about, should I put this image in there? It looks so horrible. Because it's a space that Rachel Lichtenstein and Ian Sinclair turned into a project to essentially uncover this small room at the top of the synagogue that a man, David Radinsky, lived in for his whole life, essentially. And he left one day and didn't come back, and somebody discovered it over 10 years later. And there are interesting things that happen with this. The reason I include it is because it became a story in the newspaper in London. What happened to this person? They found this room. Photographers went in and they took beautiful photographs like this one where it almost looks like it could be a Dutch still life, versus others that just show like that there was something wrong with him. Obviously, if he was living in a space like this, and there was something wrong with him. I'm not going to go into the whole story. You'll have to read that part of the essay. But what interested these two people, one of them is an artist, Rachel's an artist, Ian is a writer, was that they took it onto themselves to want to uncover who this person was. And so they went through the room kind of taking bits and pieces of scraps of notes or old letters and finding those people that the letters came from, meeting with them, asking them how they had some connection back to David Rudinsky. And it was their way of using the personal possessions that were left over as a way of understanding who a person was. But because they started off in an interior and used those pieces that they found, all these clues, it's what led them to have to travel to other places internationally. So it was kind of, in some ways, the most far-reaching of bridging interior and exterior. So I'm showing you guys that picture, even though I think it's not nice. But the last I'm showing from this section, there's just two images. This is the one that's used on the cover, and maybe I'll just skip to this one. But they're both by Abelardo Morel, and he's also a photographer whose work is amazing. He works with Pinhole cameras, and I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with them. It's one of those things where trying to give a 2-minute description of a pinhole camera can be confusing, or it could work, but maybe I'll just give a brief description to help explain how he's also bridging interior and exterior in his photographs. But some of you may know you can make pinhole cameras, which essentially are just like boxes. You poke a little hole, you can line it with photo paper. Light, the way optics work when you have just a small pinhole, is that what one would see out that little pinhole, that image gets projected inside the box and flipped upside down and backwards, and then you can take that paper out after it's been exposed long enough to light, if people remember how cameras used to work, and then you would develop that and you would have this image of outside without actually needing the mechanics of a camera. And so what Abelardo Morel does in his work is he essentially turns rooms into pinhole cameras, where he'll go into a room, in this case it was a hotel room at Times Square. He blocks off all light except for a pinhole at a window, and he knows his work well enough now that he knows exposure needs about 8 hours, and he's not lining the room with photo paper because that would be impossible, or if you have enough money, anything's possible. But instead what he's doing is, because the optics, the way the pinhole works, no matter what's on the surface of the wall, the image will project in. And so that is on the room, and then he sets up his camera in the room facing the wall and leaves the aperture open for about 8 hours. And so the film is now taking a photograph of what the room sees. And so the person who writes about his work, that's how she quotes him. He does say that for him it's about what the room sees, or in this case what the film is seeing. And when he knows that it's probably been exposed enough, he takes it out, develops the negative, and then makes the prints from that. So hopefully that makes sense. But there's interesting things that happen because the aperture is open for so long, where you would normally see cars just kind of like going back and forth all over Times Square. They're not there because they're going too quick for it to be captured over a long period of time. Or here where the alarm clock should show a time if you were to take a picture at a specific moment, because it's been exposed for so long, it just becomes a blur. So so time gets distorted in these photographs in a really strange way. You can tell what's there for a long time versus what's there for a short time. Anything that's blurred starts getting lost. So at this point, this is where I'm just going to jump into showing just a few projects for my students. Am I okay with time? Okay, good, okay. And what I like to do is have my students work at the scale of sometimes clothing, furniture, wall surfaces. And this is just a small, what I like to think of as a small pocket of a space that I leave open for them, but essentially mostly in the things I'll be showing you here are in that zone of like 1 to 2, and then some kind of go out a little bit further, and you'll see some of that. And one thing I do is I give students a project where they are asked to work directly with the body, with a shirt. I ask them to take a basic Oxford shirt and to alter it in some way where they're either using the body and developing a system from the body to make alterations to the shirt, or using something about the nature of the shirt and its proportions to alter it. And so this student, she chose to take a shirt and along every seam line, essentially sewed through it every ½ inch and then scrunched it up. And so you start seeing the moments of where there's seams on the body or on the shirt and collecting those. In some cases, they end up making these kind of garments where This was one that faculty wanted to buy. Some of them were runway ready, and she still owes me this shirt. These were some of the details of what those look like. You can see some of the mapping out. And so it really became up to the student to figure out what is the system that they want to bring to this shirt. And it was funny too, because a lot of them bought, just a small fitted shirt to their body and realized that they actually needed excess. And so they then quickly went to like Walmart and bought the biggest man's shirt they could buy. And then suddenly that gave them enough material to start doing this with, such as this student where she essentially drew a grid on the inside of the shirt. And then at every point where there was a crosshair, she would essentially just sew a little kind of pucker. And in the end, she brought this different pattern to the shirt overall. She decided where cuffs were, or things that were not part of the full, like a full set of fabric to work with, that would be a point where she would stop. So she had to make some rules in this process as well. A studio that I taught, my last studio that I taught at Texas before going to Ryerson was this past fall, and it was an advanced interior design studio. And the nice thing about it was that I had no responsibility to the school anymore. I didn't have to fill CETA requirements. I didn't have to fulfill anything, so I thought it would just be the best way for me to have fun with the studio and not do anything that the school told me to have to do. So for me, it was great. The nice thing is that I feel like students actually made some of the best work that I've seen come out of my 10 years there. I was like, oh, why didn't I do this earlier? It also says something about accreditation, that sometimes it kind of hammers things down and doesn't let you do, things that could be more fun. So, but the students, it was called Interior Skins, and we went through a whole bunch of studies and steps and throughout the semester. But the final project was for students to reflect upon what they were most interested in terms of a scale of a skin to design at. Some chose to work at the scale of the body and make clothing. Others chose to work at the scale of a room, or kind of like almost like an object room space. And I did ask them to go through a series of steps to get to these points that involved looking at precedents, programs, tools, materials. There's one other that I'm forgetting. But we had this big matrix of all those things, and they had to kind of choose elements from each of those things, make something, make it again if you change some of those attributes. And so it was kind of an iterative process that was pretty interesting to watch. This student, what she did for one of her assignments, at one point they all had to design a second skin, which could be clothing, or it could just be, or it had to be something that essentially would wrap the body. And so she started looking at mapping out the body, the ribs, which eventually led for her to start constructing this jacket, which is made out of industrial felt. And it's a really great material. And for me, actually, I was introduced to it here in Michigan because of the auto industry. And it's a great material because when you cut it, there's no fraying. It doesn't have a grain to it, so it's really easy to work with. And she essentially constructed this jacket, which opens in the front, but it also reflects the structure of the body underneath it, or even behind it where she has the spine. The interesting part, though, was the shoulder, because we're so used to seam lines being just kind of regular around the shoulder. But when she looked at the bone structure, she realized that if she followed that as a seam line, it then produced a different form. So it actually ended up revealing something new to us about clothing patterns. And then she was also interested in taking that idea into her final project. And this is where, for those of you, if you're still here, who had the workshop today, you'll see some things that came out of something similar to what you did. But what she was interested in was looking at skin and how we layer our skin. And so she made a plaster cast of her arm and realized that when the first layer reaches the arm, it's the one that's most close to the way our body is formed. And then as you add more and more plaster, it gets a little distorted, gets a little bit more homogeneous. So the inside was always kind of the real view of the body, whereas the outside was one that was a little bit more distorted. And so she decided to make this dress that she was calling the flex dress, and worked with 2 different layers of materials. The one underneath the pink, and believe me, choosing pink was like probably the most the biggest point of discussion in her critiques, because of being in interior design and choosing pink. It was like, no, and she was like, I want to use pink. She's been in a school of architecture with an interior design program for 4 years and has been taught not to use color at all. And so this was her moment to break free, and she did. So she used pink spandex because it was a material that allowed for her to register all the movement of the body. It gave the body, free rein. And then she looked at the body where before she was looking at the kind of skeletal structure, she now looked at when the body reaches and where there's extension or where things need to kind of flex to make the more stiff industrial felt be able to respond and allow it to begin to reveal the way that the body moves. So you're seeing a set of cuts in the felt that let her move with a little bit more ease. So she had all these names for positions like jump, flex, I don't know, all of them. But it was a way of her trying to draw out how the two materials could be connected together, but allowing there to be connection but flexibility too. And these are some of the details at the elbow, at the hip, and at the sides it was pretty interesting because she needed to kind of make a cut between the front and back and show that there was some distinction. And so she put two zippers that ran the whole way down the sides as a way of making that break for her. Kind of like when we, that orthographic drawing, where do you make that cut line? Where do things break? And another student in the school, there's one moment where it's almost like one plane in one of our public hallways where a vaulted space or an arch space meets a flat ceiling, and a ramp meets a step up, and then there's a step and then it ramps down, but on either side of the ramp there's this drop because of the step, or the difference between that space. And some of that will come through in the images I show you. But for her, she found that there was this kind of disconnect between these two sides of this one plane. And for her, it was about trying to resolve it. And the space that needed resolve was one of these niches that just kind of was left over and wasn't occupied. And she started working on a series of drawings to unfold the space. And this is a corner just showing part of what she worked on. But she discovered this small pocket. So in this image on the right, you're seeing the ramp, but then this little niche. And behind the niche, there's actually a little bench. So at one point, people did sit there, but then the ramp came in, and then it became a little bit less usable. But you can still go behind the end of the ramp and get in there and sit, which I'll show you in a second. But she inserted this new plane, which was meant to help bridge that kind of funny space and make it into a new interior space. She used mohair yarn to do this with, and you can see how it became this kind of strange screen in the space. When people sit behind it, they get a little blurred. You can see people moving in front of it as well, what it's like in that little niche space, and even how at the end you start seeing all the kind of the taut lines suddenly become just fringe at the end. And then another student who spans two different scales, body and I would say small pavilion or room scale, was this student, Kelsey Harper, where she was working with industrial felt again and laser cutting it, trying to figure out how to cut it so that she could get expandability to it the way that you can do that you see it with metal mesh, but obviously metal mesh, once you have it, you don't really want to play with it and do too much with it. But she was doing that with felt and did some sample pieces. I do have to warn you, if you haven't done it, felt on a laser cutter will smell really bad, like really bad, but it goes away after a while. It's okay, just to warn you. And this was the pattern for the dress that she made, which was interesting in terms of, those previous images I was showing about mapping the body. This became a new map of the body to show how the felt had to actually expand in order to wrap the body, and the shawl piece that she made as well for it. And she brought some of that same technique to a small pavilion space and wanted to see, well, rather than just the felt, kind of wrapping around and expanding, she wanted people to actually put pressure on the felt and have it respond in a different way. So she built this little pavilion. Some of the slits go one direction, some go the other way, and that was all in terms of how the space was being used on the inside. And it was a pretty tight space because it was meant to kind of push people against the felt. So here you're seeing the two people sitting there, and then you're seeing the impression of the two people. That's not one big butt. I've been told that it looks like that sometimes, so I just want to let you know that. But it's the impression of two different people, of those two people sitting there. And so suddenly from the inside and outside, you could see that relationship of what was happening through the material. And I think I just have maybe two more to go through. This was another student who was now kind of shifting scale away from the textile and wanting to start thinking about walls and just thinking about a brick. And she was really fascinated, just thinking about what a brick unit is and the mortar that goes in it, and how it could be an inside, an interior material, but an exterior material at the same time. And so she cast her own bricks. It was meant to be like 3 big walls, and she realized how time-consuming it was, so this was how far she got. But what she had done was she made formwork. She had kind of this large formwork piece that she kept working with, and lined one side of it with like a lace material, which you're seeing here to pick up the impression. And that was meant to reference the interior, where normally that's where we bring pattern and textures. Whereas the other side was the wood that's typically used to leave impressions for formwork and concrete pours. And so you felt like, yeah, that feels a little bit more like outside, whereas one felt more like inside. And so she wanted these bricks to really span those sensibilities that we have about materials and their impressions. And then this is the last one I'm just going to take you through, because it kind of shifts into the kind of larger zone that I was talking about in terms of what students were working on. This was the only project where there were 2 people working together, and they essentially just wanted to make this pavilion, or a space that was growing out of this grid and kind of tapering the grid at times or thickening it at times, as a way of understanding what it means just to occupy a really basic grid that we typically draw all the time, whether it's column grids or comes in many forms. And so they had this model that they kept kind of like plucking away at, inserting things in, and they were also really interested in Japanese joinery. And so they developed a joint system where the X, Y, and Z axes all met at the same point. And they used our CNC router for like 2 weeks straight. It was unbelievable. They pushed the limits of the machine, had to have our tech people come in on the weekends, which normally they wouldn't do, but they were so interested in pushing that boundary that they wanted to see where the limits were. So, but they got it working again. But it was nice to see, because in the process of working on this, they essentially had to figure out the cheapest way of doing this, and it meant buying plywood, having to cut out the strips rather than buying strips, which were more expensive. So there's a whole kind of other story to that. But they did something smart. They started a Kickstarter page, and in 3 weeks they were able to raise $1,400 to help fund their project. So it was pretty entrepreneurial of them. And sometimes I feel like people have to kind of take that route if they really want to see things through. And in the process of going through and fine-tuning this space that people would occupy and the actual construction of it, they really had to develop essentially a calendar for themselves and a whole production calendar. They went back and forth also with analog and digital fabrication. They realized that they couldn't do it all in just digital, that they had to use analog as well. And I thought that was a good complement. They established their grid in a space and just started building this thing. They knew where every single stick had to go. It was unbelievable. It was like the most intense planning for this space. But within the space, they also built this bench area so somebody could sit and look through it, or you could walk around it. So it became this pavilion that was, kind of at that farther end of that larger diagram that I was showing you, or the little kind of pulled box. And that was sort of the biggest one that came out of this interior skin studio. So, and I think that's probably a good place to end this talk as well. And I'm glad to answer any questions that you have.
When you talk about mapping throughout the presentation, it seems as though it's all about the observation. So the mapping happens in a variety of levels. If I think about how the mapping translates to some of the objects, let's say the fashion object that touched the body, I do question, where does the politic come in? Where does, let's say, the corset that shaped and changed the woman's body, where does the kind of social politics start to infuse and challenge the work that you're showing right now?
That's such a good question, and I feel like I think I could probably talk, but I can put that here. But that's such a good question, because I feel like that's where the dialogue in the studio really happened, and in the critiques. Just that one example of, I mean, it's not so much about the mapping part with the corset, but that decision of pink and identity, and how disciplines have certain, they're always associated in certain ways. And that just opened up this whole level of discussion within the studio, but also with reviewers as well. And there was that student, her critique, so much of it revolved just around color. And it's funny because there's not, that kind of discussion would never happen if a student showed an interior elevation and chose certain colors. I mean, somebody might question it, but when it suddenly came to the body, it was so much more personal, and it really made people question that identity of gender, color. And so I feel like that conversation happened there. That's one of those things where I hope that it kind of finds another life through the students, that they begin to question the things that they're doing, those decisions. And it's interesting also with Hussein Chalian's work with the wood corset. It's funny because for me, I always think about the Eameses and working with plywood, but it's so much about like, oh, that's like furniture, but there is that whole other side of, is it actually more like a shell or the protective shell of a woman, which doesn't always get discussed in the discourse, I feel like, of architecture or interior design. It may happen more in fashion theory, and that's where I feel like that kind of role of fashion theory could come in and start making us realize the kinds of maneuvers we make could begin to inform that.
So when you were talking about your project, going from the orthographic drawing, or taking the chair and deconstructing it towards an orthographic drawing, my question is, going from 2 dimensions to 3 dimensions, and then in the case of the architect, I don't know if he was an architect where he cut the buildings, but is there, is there a way, or is there too much going back and forth in a project? So if you wanted to go, in those directions, 2D to 3D, and then go back to 2D, and then go to 3D, is there any research that you've done that's indicated maybe a watering down of the progression or something like that?
Well, I think at a certain point it runs out of steam. It does. That there's only so much you can do in terms of the back and forth. And so for me, it really was that one large gesture, but I never actually went back to then, a representation of it. And so I think after a while it becomes redundant, and so it finds its own way of ending. And I think when I look at a lot of mapping or the representation from 2D to 3D, it really is almost, you find that point of when something is productive, and then after that point, it just kind of, goes back, it just becomes redundant to it. But mapping and the way that people have worked with maps over centuries, to me, is always revealing of, okay, there's an idea as one starting point. Could that then be taken into another level? And I think that's where it becomes more of what people begin to do or see with those as being generative and making from that. But I think at a certain point it does kind of find its limit and saying that, okay, this is where it kind of does stop.
I found it interesting, especially using the platform of fashion in the process to design, because we're talking about these 2D imageries, orthographic images, these static images, when actually the way we experience the space is continuous movement with our eyes shifting side to side. So I think it's interesting that we use the medium of the 2D or 3D or the static 3D image to design a space that you'll never experience in that same fashion. So I guess what interests me most about the lecture is using that platform of fashion, or how do we design like we design fashion for that continuous motion. So, I don't know if that's a question or a comment, but.
But for me, I think that's where, and I think it's the whole interdisciplinary realm, that by looking at other disciplines, it helps reveal to us areas that have become just, I don't know, I think boring or mundane. And it's like, well, what else can we infuse into that? Or that? But for me, it's always about, there has to be some at least logical connection between things as a way of saying, oh yeah, it can enter into the discourse. And part of that for me is just, I just want there to be some amount of logic embedded in something, versus sometimes when things are just so without logic, it just becomes too loose. And so that's where it's that careful understanding of what happens in a discipline and how they work.
I feel like, but to your point, it doesn't seem as though there is a large body of knowledge or text that supports the discipline of interior architecture, interior design. And I think it's a critical discussion that we're having in the college currently, because we're within a college of architecture. But in fact, that the practice of interior design is it has sympathetic alignment with architecture, but it's much different. So I'm wondering how it's being received as a critical body of knowledge.
I feel like when I first of all, when I first got the contract to do this, I was just like, I can't believe it. You know, that Princeton Architectural Press would actually, you know, want to put this out there. And then I was like, okay, if one person buys it and has the same vision, I will be so happy. And so, you know, that's happened. Like, one other person got it. I'm really happy. But I feel like I've had really good reception in terms of when people do give me feedback, it's helpful for me to hear why they're interested in it. And a lot of the times I think it's because they're, in some ways, it is interdisciplinary. And I think that's what people like about it, is that it can be much more interdisciplinary. And yes, it does have architectural references to it. I think that's unavoidable, the same way that for me it's unavoidable that the interior has fashion reference to it. And so I think that's one of the strengths of it that I hear back, is that the whole interdisciplinary part, or that, especially for me, the way that sculptors or artists work, that it's like, oh yes, you can actually see how they're working in the space of an interior and how it helps bring their work to fruition in a way that, you know, a different discipline may not. But if they're using the space like that, then why shouldn't we be looking at their work? So I think it's been really people being happy that it's interdisciplinary. Yeah. Yep. God, yay.
Okay, your book is, you know, the title is Towards a New Interior. So can you share your vision about the kind of changes you would, you know, like to see in the practice, or the, you know, the real world interior design?
That's a good question. Well, I think also I think what I'm interested in is, some of it is the work that's produced, but also the body of literature that's out there. And I think because interior design in some ways is seen as such a young discipline, you know, one could say that Adolf Loos was one of the first interior designers, or I almost kind of feel like he was really one of the first to start more rigorously constructing the interior. Not quite sure how to put that, but the fact that for so long there hasn't been, I think, a body of literature that I've been looking for. And so it could just be that there's a different way of, you know, one coming through or coming to interior design. And people come to interior design all different ways, especially people who go into masters. They may have a background in English or something, or, you know, anything. But how does one get there? They bring things to that with them. And I realized that when there wasn't, you know, literature I could look that would make me think. Like, I don't want just the history stuff, because I love history, but it needed to be more than that. And so some of this does reference history, it builds it into it, but it's also trying to draw a connection between here's something historical, but also here's something that is more theoretical, and how can the two begin to share information. So one of my hopes is that the diagram that I helped establish is one way of allowing for different bodies of, you know, other people's literature to say, well, they feel like they want to fit in here, or take that part and take it somewhere. And, you know, I would love it if somebody would take the part on mapping the interior and kind of write a whole book on it, because I would personally love to see that happen. So part of it, I think, is wanting the body of literature to change. And then in design, I think every design studio instructor has an idea of, you know, everything should be like this, but for me, it's always just, you know, even if the book didn't come out, I would still be interested in seeing how design work always changes. Yeah.
I'm wondering if you consciously left out sound, because I think you touched on all the other senses, even with the reference to smell and the industrial felt, which I'm sure has some effect on a person's design abilities.
That's a good point. And the senses are something that I did think about in working through this book. But it's one of those areas where, in terms of the layers that one occupies, for me it was more about establishing those layers, and then that cross-section of other elements that come out, that's where the senses would be included, because they don't just exist at, you know, one layer. They happen at the scale of the body, they happen at the scale of a room. Some of the essays do touch upon sound in a way that's not traditional interior design, but more of things that happen in a space. So to me, it's one of those areas where sound permeates all of those things, or at least I hope it does. Yeah.